All right, welcome to The Real Deal with John Fox. Once again, we're going to be talking about JFK with you, and we appreciate Dr. Fetzer filling us in on a very historic, significant clip with Jim Garrison actually saying in video that Oswald was standing in the doorway, just like he said to Will Fritz, I was standing in the doorway. We also have Harold Weisberg saying the same thing. It appears to me that we have been killing a lot of time because there's a handful of researchers that had it figured out back then, and everyone else seems to be muddying up the water. Hopefully we're helping clear it up. All right, Don, tell us what we got on tap with these videos you've got.
Okay, yeah, thanks for having me back, Gary. I thought, the last show with the Permindex stuff, the material was a little thick, and, maybe if we have some new people in the audience, let's maybe start out kind of where I started out. These clips are kind of where I got my foundation of JFK. This was before I really heard even Jim Fetzer on, say, Coast to Coast AM or some of those other shows back in the 90s. I was paying attention to stuff like, the movie JFK. That's what really got me into the whole thing. From there, I figured out, well, who's this Prouty guy? So I went and got that book, and then I saw The Men Who Killed Kennedy, and then we'll talk about the Z film alterations as well.
So we're going way back. Let's approach this show as a 101 for people who may be just getting new to it, and I would like to personally pledge I will do my best to bring the best information and the most truthful, because this is one of the slipperiest slopes you'll ever encounter.
It is a very slippery slope, and as I was talking to Claire last week, I said, hey, this stuff is like a minefield. You're going to make a misstep and you're going to get blown up. It's just inevitable, but you can't let it get you down. Hey, this was I went down a bad path here. So you get confronted by new info, go ahead and adjust. Don't bury your hands and don't freak out. Just keep marching forward. And you have to almost take a kind of a third person perspective on it. Don't get so wrapped up in this stuff personally that you have a personal investment in any of the info.
All right, well, our first video you have is Fletcher Prouty, so this is going way back when. So let's go ahead and watch that, and we'll comment when we come back.
Sure.
Many millions of people around the world have by now been introduced to you, at least indirectly, through the character of the Mr. X in Oliver Stone's movie JFK. You were in correspondence and communication with Oliver Stone throughout much of the preparation and making of the movie, and of course prior to that you had a correspondence and working relationship with Jim Garrison. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I know you know that Garrison wrote a book on the trail of the assassin.
Right.
And because we had corresponded for years, he sent me a manuscript of his book, and I thought the book was wonderful, but it was the story of Miami, New Orleans, Dallas, and it didn't think about Washington, New York, Frankfurt, Germany, the money centers. And to me, you got to follow the money line. So I would write to Jim and I'd say, look, the book is good, but we need to put this in or this. And he respected that. And later, sometime, I don't really know when, we weren't that close, he was talking with Oliver Stone. Stone had an idea of doing this movie. And in the process, showed Stone some of this material that I had written. So Stone called me in July of 1990. And he said, I'm going to be in Washington. I'd like to meet you, and I want you to work as an advisor. This movie I'm planning. So we met. We got along just fine, and I told him I agreed to be an advisor and work with him. So the material, and much of it, is straight out of the book. The words that you remember from the film are in the book, and that part of the book I had written in 1985. It was already a series of articles that had been published, already published. And it was based on that the ending of the movie, where Donald Sutherland, who played my part, comes in and talks to Kevin Costner, who played Jim Garrison's part, and they begin to describe why was Kennedy killed. Not who did it and all that sort of thing, or who's covering it up, but why was Kennedy killed? And this is what I tried to answer during that bit of the movie.
I think the movie very much benefited from that scene because it gave the audience a chance to get the bigger picture. And I must say that as good as I found the movie to be, I think the book, your new book, really goes much further in terms of really elaborating on that critical question, cui bono. Apropos of the Kennedy assassination aspect of the book. I think the question that everybody who was alive at the time and old enough to remember is always asked, and it's always very useful to know, is where were you when John Kennedy was assassinated? You were presumably still active duty in the Pentagon at this time. I would think, given your capacity, that you would have been in a sort of a critical position to at least have some window on the security concerns in Dallas and things like that. Were you in Dallas that day? Were you in Washington? Or?
In November of 1963, I was the Chief of Special Operations, which is supporting clandestine operations, CIA, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And rather an unusual meeting. I was walking down the hall in October, and a general said, "Oh, glad to see you, Prouty. I wanted to talk with you." He said, "You are being ordered to go to the South Pole with a group of VIP people who are going down there to install a nuclear plant." And I thought, well, nice vacation, but you know, nuclear is not my business. I've been here 9 years in the Pentagon now, all on one kind of job. But we had some CIA activity in Antarctica, but not enough to warrant a trip down there. So I accepted it in good faith. I saw no problems with it. And the next thing I know, November 10th, I'm on a plane on the way to Honolulu, down to New Zealand, and down to McMurdo Sound and to the South Pole. And we fired up the nuclear plant at McMurdo and then came back to Christchurch, New Zealand. By that time, I'd gotten to know a congressman who was a member of the party quite well. And we were sitting down to breakfast. I never forget this, because down there, that was Saturday morning when the president was killed. And all of a sudden, the radio in the place said, "Ladies and gentlemen, BBC have announced that Kennedy, President Kennedy, has been killed in Dallas." Boy, you could have heard a pin drop clear to Australia. Stunning news, you know. So there was nothing we could do. There wasn't a radio station. We didn't have radios. So after we finished breakfast, we went out on the street. A few hours later, I was able to buy a newspaper, the Christchurch Star, which I still have, which was in the movie, by the way. Jeff, remember Sutherland?
Right, I do, sure, yeah.
And I looked at the paper, at the terrible news, and of course had nothing else to balance it against except some of my own experience. I had worked on the business of presidential protection. You know, the military is trained in presidential protection. I had gone to Mexico City, for example, with Eisenhower when he went there in 56 or 57 and so on. I was familiar with it. And at times I had to call certain units to be in certain places to provide extra support to the Secret Service. So we were looking at the paper, and up in the corner is a picture of this building where the man that shot the president was alleged to have hidden, called the Texas School Book Depository Building. And as I looked, I saw the windows were open. And I turned to Congressman. I said, "Pete, something's wrong. We don't allow that. The windows would be sealed. If the military were there, if the Secret Service was there, those windows would be sealed." Then right beside the picture was a headline that said, "3 bursts of automatic weapon fire killed the president." Of course, having nothing else to go by, I figured that's the way he died. 3 bursts of automatic weapon fire. You know what we have heard now, 3 bullets from an old rifle up on the top of the go boom, boom, boom. Now, reporters on the spot know the difference between an automatic weapon and the... Then down in the lower corner of the paper, very interestingly, it gave the whole biographical story of this young man, Lee Harvey Oswald. And of course, we read every word of it, inside the thing, and a whole bunch of it on the inside page, plus a picture of Oswald in a nice business suit, white shirt on, necktie on. Have you ever seen a picture of Oswald dressed like that? When I got back to the States, I kept looking through newspapers everywhere to find a picture of Oswald in a business suit, but that's what had been sent by radio photo somehow to the newspapers around the world before the police in Dallas had arraigned him. I took that paper home, and through my resources in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I made phone calls and checked things out. That information that appeared in that paper about Oswald's biography and everything, all of that part of it, had been written and sent before the police in Dallas had arraigned the man. How could a reporter be working on just some 24-year-old boy and have the story all ready to go if he didn't know from the police who they had charged with the crime? So ever since then, I've been building up more and more information to see these things that were manufactured as a cover story ever since that murder. And of course, the biggest cover story is the Warren Commission report.
Now, let me make sure I get this straight. November 23rd, 1963, in New Zealand, Australia area, is November 22nd in the United States.
Yes,
In other words, this is really the same day. This is not the following day.
No, it's over the date line. That's right.
And this newspaper in an obscure area of New Zealand, this was?
Well, it's a big city in South Island, Christchurch, yep.
So in other words, this story, this biographical profile, as well as the details of the assassination, was about the very first news coverage that reached Australia and New Zealand.
All prepackaged, see? Now, in a few minutes like this, Jeff, I can't go through the whole thing, but to give you some relevancy here, the president was shot at 12:30 in Dallas. We heard it at 7:30 in New Zealand the next day, but that'll give you how many hours it was. In the book, I go through it very carefully, and it comes out. And you just see that somebody had prepared this whole story to make Oswald the patsy, just as he said he was, just like in the movie. They said that he said he was the patsy, and he was created for that job, which tells you really more about the whole crime than most of us have been willing to accept until we begin to realize the facts of life.
The events of the Kennedy assassination, obviously you don't believe for a minute from reading the book and from other things that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin of John Kennedy. You pointed out to me quite a few months ago in an earlier discussion that we had that shortly before his death, President Lyndon Johnson had made some comments about the Kennedy assassination. Could you tell us about that? It was an interview, I believe, somewhere?
That's one of the most interesting things I have read since the assassination, because, you know, a lot of people say, well, of course Lyndon Johnson was implicated, and so on and so on. It couldn't possibly be. But just before Johnson died in '73, he had had some serious heart trouble, and I'm sure the gentleman knew that he didn't have long to live. He had an old friend who was a writer named Leo Janos, and Janos wrote for the Atlantic Monthly magazine. So anyone who's interested should look in the Atlantic Monthly magazine of July 1973, and I'll quote the best I can. Johnson told Janos he always believed there was a conspiracy. Now that's a pretty big statement for the man that appointed the Warren Commission. It's a pretty big statement, but he told him they would always believe there was a conspiracy. Second, he said, although Oswald may have pulled the trigger, he wasn't the only one. So he wasn't alone. The third statement hits like a thunderclap. He said, we have been running a damn murder incorporated in the government. Now, through my work, regrettably so, I have to admit that we do run a murder incorporated. I know where they were. I know most of them are foreigners. I know how they're used and have used them. And I know how they do the job, and it's nothing like Lee Harvey Oswald up sitting on a windowsill. When Johnson said those three things, anybody could wrap up the murder and find out what the problem is right there. Now, nobody, I'm sure, knew the situation closer than Johnson. Remember, for over 19 years, right here in Washington, D.C., Johnson's across-the-street neighbor was J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover and Johnson were that close. What Hoover knew, Johnson knew, except on betting on horses. But other than that, Hoover knew what Johnson knew and vice versa. So there's no surprises when you read that this is what Johnson thought in 1973.
A kind of an evaluative question, which I guess asks you to take a great deal of the material that's extraordinarily well documented in the book and sort of put it in a few brief sentences. Obviously, as you emphasize, the question of who were the actual triggermen is of relatively secondary importance as to who were the actual authors and controllers of the operation. Do you think it's fair to say that the motives behind the Kennedy assassination had to do with the sort of monumental policy changes that he was about to effect, and that could you give us sort of a characterization of who, in general terms, you think was responsible for this?
Well, that's a good way to put it. There's no way in a brief period, I've done it as best I can through the book, to explain that when Kennedy became president, one of the first moves he made, he gave McNamara orders to hold up on the TFX contract. Everybody kind of forget that, but that was a very advanced fighter plane contract worth $6.5 billion in 1961 money, which is a big contract. That's only letting the contract. They usually run 10 times that through what we call life of type. That was big money. They held up the contract, and finally, by a specialized system that McNamara and Arthur Goldberg, the Secretary of Labor, set up, they allocated the contract to a company that had created an area of subcontracting throughout the country in the political counties where Kennedy needed the vote most. Remember, Kennedy got elected by the skin of his teeth. So where he had beaten Nixon by only a few votes, well, put a little factory there. Where Nixon had beaten him a little bit, put a bigger factory there, and they had it spread. It was a beautiful plan. It took walls of the Pentagon covered with these maps. And then McNamara, on the 23rd of November 1962, allocated that contract. Well, in the halls of the Pentagon, you couldn't hear a civil word. I mean, this was Kennedy that, and goddamn Kennedy this, because everybody knew that the contract was going to the contractor that the Eisenhower administration had set up. Things like that create pressures. Saying he's not going to put Americans in Vietnam. That war ran to a minimum cost of $220 billion, probably all up $500 billion. People will kill for money like that. They'll kill for contracts within that. 10 million men were flown to Saigon by commercial airline. That was worth $1 billion. They wouldn't have gone. So when you create that kind of pressure, you create what it takes to murder a president. And the decision then is very clean, handled by a few people. The gunmen come from outside the United States. Nobody knows about it. There's no Cubans involved. There's no mafia involved. There's no this involved. All these people that talk about it, that's cover story. Cover story is the most difficult thing to run. That's been running 30 years now. And think of the pressures that cover story has been creating over the last 30 years to keep it up front, to have really famous, intelligent newspapermen say, there's no substantive history, anything except that Oswald killed Kennedy, and so on and so on. So I mean, it's a cover story. It's ridiculous. The American Medical Association trotted these poor old autopsy people out, and we're saying, oh, well, now the bullet went this way and went through Kennedy, came out of his neck, of course, and went down into Connolly, broke his wrist right through his head.
Right. Exactly.
You know, a cover story is a terrible thing to create. Murder is simple. Just a little scalpel and you do it.
I hate to break off at this point, and I wish we had another 3 hours to continue because we've really just barely scratched the surface. But I want to just at this point say, Colonel Fletcher Prouty, thank you very much for being with us here. Your book is one of the most thought-provoking and critical pieces of historiography that I, for one, have ever read, and I think it's essential reading for anyone trying to get to the bottom of contemporary history. This is Jeff Steinberg, and I want to thank you for being with us today for the LaRouche Connection.
A very impressive video. They covered a lot of stuff there. Don, go ahead.
Okay, so Colonel Prouty was one of my early influences on, he was kind of an early mentor on how does the intelligence community actually work, how does military work, how do the two operate together. So I went from being a complete civilian working guy to having a basic understanding of the way the military and the intelligence community works. And that's thanks to Colonel Prouty. One of the things he talked about in the clip here was the real questions to ask are who did it and why. Look beyond Dallas. Look at Washington, D.C., New York, and Frankfurt. That's what he was talking about. He could tell it was an operation when he was down in New Zealand. He picked up the paper on Saturday morning. He picked up the Christchurch Star. And I've got that PDF here on my machine. They were talking about 3 bursts of automatic gunfire. On Saturday morning in New Zealand, they had a full biography of Lee Oswald before he was even charged in Dallas with killing Kennedy.
Yeah, I actually talked to Jim Mars and I asked that question. Let's play that clip right quick and see what Jim Mars has to say.
You know what? That was Fletcher Prouty's deal, and because he was in Christchurch, New Zealand, and he saw the newspapers and had a picture of Oswald, and he gave us a little bit of his background and everything. And he said because of the time difference, it was still early in Texas. And he said, how did they get all this information so soon? Well, listen, I could show you the front page of the Fourth Press in 1959 or 60, whenever he went to Russia, and they had the same picture of him, and they talked about his background. So it was in the newspaper files And with AP and their ability to wire photos and telegraph news, it's possible. I think he has a real point there, but I don't think you're going to really prove it. 15 years after the Kennedy assassination, and I know I was here, it was socially unacceptable to talk about the assassination. We just don't talk about that.
All right, there you have it. Jim Marr saying that it was possible. They did have things on file, but Fletcher Prouty's got a lot of points to be made here.
Yeah. Another great point that Prouty made was the Atlantic magazine back in 1973 interviewed Johnson just before he died, and he told the Atlantic that indeed there was a conspiracy, that Oswald was a shooter, but he had help. And then the most memorable quote out of that thing probably was, "We were running a goddamn Murder Incorporated down in the Caribbean," quote.
We're talking about Johnson right now.
Yep, Lyndon Johnson, yeah, he was talking about the Caribbean. I was familiar with that quote, but I didn't know where it came from, and it came from the Atlantic Monthly magazine back, I think it was in July 73. Yeah, the Christchurch Star was the newspaper Prouty read on his way back from the South Pole. And then Johnson was interviewed by the Atlantic magazine shortly before he died.
I do remember him saying that. A lot of researchers, including Dr. Fetzer, would have a lot to say about Fletcher Prouty believing that Johnson had nothing to do with the assassination.
Well, that's not exactly what Prouty said. Prouty said he wouldn't have probably originated, the plot wouldn't have originated with him, and that's undoubtedly true. He said Johnson had intimate knowledge of what happened. Johnson didn't give a full deathbed confession there, but he kind of went part of the way.
Yeah, he went around too much longer after that.
No.
Let's talk about the Vietnam aspect. That's what Garrison was talking about on the Trail of Assassins. It wasn't just about the assassination. It was about the Vietnam War and how we got in there.
There was that, yeah, and Prouty also mentioned the TFX fighter contract, which was basically almost ready to go under the Eisenhower administration, but then Kennedy held it up, and it was a very political thing about what counties were going to get work out of it. It got down to that level where pro-Kennedy counties ended up getting money for the fighter, and then other people got left out. Behind the scenes, that caused a lot of angst over at the Pentagon, and then the decision to withdraw from Vietnam was the final straw with the military people.
I was surprised to hear Prouty say that people will kill over these contracts. Seems to go a little more beyond that.
Yeah, that's apparently, he was right about that. Well, he was in the Pentagon halls for a long time, so he would be familiar with that.
Talked about the cover story, but I guess we've covered the cover story.
Yep.
As far as we can go. All right, let's go into the next clip, the Z film, Alteration. Now, Dr. Fetzer has been making these points for 20 years. All right.
Yeah, and before I had come across Jim's work on this is the clip that I had seen, and in 10 minutes, it just really blows the Z film right out of the water.
All right, so what date do we have on this video? Do you think?
I believe it was uploaded. It was uploaded on November 2010. I could have swore that I had seen it earlier than that. It says July 31st, 2008 was when it was uploaded. So yeah, that's about right. I think I came across it in early 2009.
Dr. Fetzer was bringing this up in, I think, 91, I believe. So it's the first you heard about it, correct?
This was, I had heard rumblings, but I didn't really know what to make out of it, because I'm like, what do you mean they faked the Z film? I saw this, and I was like, oh, boy. Was I a chump?
They faked the Z film.
Yeah, boy, was I a chump. Boy, I fell for that garbage hook, line, and sinker.
All right, here we go. Yep. Let's check it out.
One of the major pieces of evidence in the assassination of John F. Kennedy, an 8mm home movie taken by a local businessman named Abraham Zapruder. The Zapruder film was featured in Life magazine and became a focal point in the Warren Commission investigation. Does the Zapruder film we see today accurately represent the true events of November 22nd, 1963? Or has it been altered, as many researchers have suggested? In the following analysis, we shall attempt to find out. As you watch the film, you can see how the random motion of the camera makes analysis of the events difficult. Our first step is to remove as much of this extra motion as possible, to focus solely on the movement of the limousine and the people in the scene. You can see that once the limousine is stabilized, it is easier to follow the movement of the people in the car and on the lawn. Previous researchers have stabilized the limousine as well to focus solely on the actions of Kennedy in the car. Now we're going to do something different. The first bystanders we see on the lawn seem to be looking not at the limousine which is passing them, but behind it, as if it has not reached them yet. This odd reaction would seem to support the idea that the background action is out of sync with the limousine. Let's take a look at the way separate layers could be combined in a 1963 era film using either an optical printer or an animation stand. Both use the same principle. The background bystanders on the lawn would need to be separated by masking out the limousine. This would leave a blank area in the foreground. In order to retime the background without this blank area showing, the background could be enlarged and reframed to create an overlap area. Then the limousine layer, with the background masked out, could overlap this new background and be retimed and positioned independently, allowing its speed to be controlled as well. These layers joined together form what is called a composite. The jitter could then be applied to this composite to create the final effect. It has been argued by John Costella, Ph.D., that the Stemmons freeway sign which passes in front of the limousine has been fabricated. His detailed analysis shows how the sign does not exhibit the same lens distortion or align in perspective with other objects in the scene. If the sign were a separate layer on top of the limousine, this would be the perfect way to cover the change between real and retimed footage. We also see Mary Mormon standing with her friend in the red coat, clearly on the lawn, when according to her testimony, she stepped forward onto the street when she took her picture as Kennedy was shot. If the lawn footage has been retimed, we may actually be seeing an earlier moment before she stepped forward. Another unsettling aspect to the bystanders is their unusually large size in relation to their distance from the limousine and its occupants, as if the entire background had been blown up. This again supports the theory that the background layer has been resized separately. As the car passes the last couple on the lawn, the man's legs go from a position of standing feet together to standing wide apart in one frame. That's an 1/18 of a second, which is a near physical impossibility, not to mention strange. It is, however, the logical point to cut from the retimed background back to real footage as the car speeds away. Here's an example of bystanders showing motion blur. Notice their shadows on the lawn are also blurry, as they naturally would be. However, just a few frames later, we see this. The bystanders are even more blurred, yet their shadows are impossibly sharp. This is a clear example of retouching, and further proof that the background has been altered. Although the lamppost passes in front of the limousine, it exhibits no movement in relation to the far background, as it should, being an object much closer in three-dimensional space to the panning camera. It also displays an odd, blurred extension on its lower left side, where it passes in front of the limousine, giving the lamppost an artificial, cut-out appearance. This further supports the theory that the limousine layer has been separated from the background lawn. Therefore, the lamppost would need to be cut out as well to overlay the limousine. Inconsistencies regarding the actions of the people in the limousine have been a point of discussion among researchers. For example, the driver turns his head twice to look behind and then forward faster than physically possible, which seems to indicate removed frames. The head turns correspond to 2 points at which the passengers lurch forward as if the car has braked suddenly, although the car shows only gradual slowing compared to the background. The second of these brakes seems to be strong enough to throw Connolly and his wife completely to the floor of the car, and the driver and front passenger forward as well. These examples alone point to significant retiming of the limousine speed. The sprocket hole area on the left side of the frame reveals an interesting clue when the motorcycle officer momentarily pulls up from behind the limousine at the same time as the second passenger lurch. This seems to indicate either the motorcycle suddenly sped up, or, more likely, the limousine suddenly braked, and the officer was not prepared for it and braked later, having the effect of pulling up alongside the limousine. Yet, the film does not seem to show the limousine slowing or stopping, again supporting the theory that the timing has been altered. This brings us to our final question. Why would someone do this? As mentioned before, the passengers in the limousine lunge forward at one point as if the car has braked suddenly. Many witnesses at the time testified that they saw the limousine slow or stop at the time Kennedy received the fatal headshot. Imagine the outcome of the Warren Commission investigation if they had seen a film in 1963 showing the Secret Service driver bringing the presidential limousine to a complete stop after shots had been fired to allow the assassin a clear, unmoving target for the fatal headshot. Who would they investigate then? A lone gunman? We began this presentation asking the question, does the Zapruder film today accurately represent the true events of November 22nd, 1963? Our answer is no. Let's review our findings. The pasted freeway sign, the large bystanders, the painted shadows, the cutout lamppost, the lurching passengers, the braking motorcycle. Once you have seen this evidence, it's difficult to watch the Zapruder film and see it as anything but a fabrication. Those who created it never wanted us to see even this much, but now it is too late. We know that the film was altered and retimed before the public saw it, most likely to hide the stopping of the limousine. Once this fact is accepted, an enormous house of cards begins to fall. If the Secret Service driving the limousine was involved, who else was involved? If the Secret Service, FBI, or CIA, who all had possession of the original Zapruder film, were involved in its alteration, what does that mean? If Time Life, which immediately bought the rights to the film and then refused to show it for decades, was involved, what does that mean? If the Warren Commission based their report on the timeline of a false Zapruder film, what does that mean?
All right, Don, I have to say I can see where this might raise an eyebrow or two.
Yeah, okay, so one of the first things, and I think John Costella had broken this down, that the Stemmons freeway sign was painted in. But John Costella breaks it down at a PhD level, whereas in this clip here, they just kind of shove it in your face. Like, okay, this is a load of BS. That's that Stemmons freeway sign that got pasted in there. That's where they kind of transitioned from real time to the altered film.
And it just makes all the sense in the world. You have a lot to cover up for just a split second.
Yeah, and what really got me was where they show the people in the background. It's like when you're watching the Zapruder film, you're always watching the limo and what's going on there. You don't really pay attention to the grass. But when you stop and look at what's going on, they make a point where, okay, all the people are looking this way, but the limo's already past them.
I believe what I understand is a lot of the background is when the lead car had passed by. No one's excited, no one's jumping up and down because it's the same time that Jesse Curry was in the car, and so was Bill Decker was in the car as well. That's about the time it's passing. This is what a lot of research has uncovered, and that's why the people are moving a little bit, but they're not jumping up and down because it's just the chief of police going by.
The painted shadows, I thought, was another thing. And so the people are not only, they're too big. If you look at them, they're not a scale with the limo. The people in the grass are much larger than the people in the limo, and then their movements are all out of sync. I've seen one clip where, I'm not sure if it was in this one or was a different one, but there's a guy towards the end after Kennedy had been shot. You see him back in the grass. He looks like he's about 9 feet tall. His legs are moving, but he's not going anywhere.
Stick man.
Yeah, exactly. What is up with that? So obviously, the film has been heavily altered.
Jack White would brought up that, and you can see him go across the screen.
Yeah, and then another point that these guys make is, okay, so what they're really trying to hide is the limo stop. By removing frames of the film, it makes the people in the limo appear to move a lot faster than they did. So if you watch Greer and then the other person in the front seat, their heads are snapping around so fast. See, that's where all this garbage with Greer shot Kennedy comes from, because they're looking at this altered film and Greer's moving so fast, they think maybe he's up to something there, but all it is really that frames were removed from the film and he's just moving a lot faster than any human actually could move.
Yeah, let's play a clip or two of the motorcycle officers if they thought there was a limo stop or not.
The film, the Zapruder film, is an 8mm film that I'm going to send you.
All right.
All right, take a look at it and I'll give you a call. See what you see in it.
All right, I will do.
Because we see a lot of things in there. In fact, we see one thing which is very disturbing, that the car doesn't even stop in that film. Doesn't even slow down.
Doesn't slow down at all.
No, somebody's monkeying around with something.
I would have sworn that it was the time that he tried to get up, that the car stopped, and then
You say who was trying to get up?
the agent after the shooting, that when he came up and jumped on the back of the car, at that instant is when it stopped, and I believe he lost his balance. And then they started again, and of course it was throwing him off, and that's when she turned around and I thought was trying to help him get up on help him up on the back of the limousine.
That's not what Hargis feels.
You don't think it is?
No, he feels he wants to get the hell out of there.
Well, that may be true too, but I really don't think so. I think she was trying to help him up. I don't believe that she was. That's not. I don't believe that'd be a normal human reaction to climb over the back of a vehicle when you're so used to going out a door.
Do you remember how long it stopped when it was on Elm Street?
Oh, you mean after that first shot?
Right.
Only about 3-4 seconds, maybe 5 or 6. That's all.
You say it stopped for about 5 or 6 seconds?
Yeah, but you won't find that in the Warren Commission report.
Don't they claim that it stopped?
Huh?
Don't they claim that it stopped?
No. I don't think he didn't. You've seen a rolling stop, haven't you? It's going less than 1 mile an hour.
Right.
Well, that's what he was doing. He wasn't completely stopped to the dead still.
All right, there you go. The closest people to the motorcade saying the whole thing has been altered. The film's been cut up. The limo stopped. They all say the same thing. I think we got to give it to Larry Rivera for uncovering all these clips. Just amazing.
Yeah, Larry's done a lot of great work. There's no question about that.
If you want new research, he is the guy to turn to, and we will be talking to Larry probably next show. We're going to move on to Rich De La Rosa, and this is about the unseen Zapruder film. There's always been the idea that there were two Zapruder films, the heavily altered one that we're used to seeing, and there's the other one. Here we go. I always did like Rich De La Rosa.
The film started with the limousine on Houston Street as it approached the turn onto Elm Street. At that point, William Greer, the driver of the limo, had difficulty maneuvering that 110-degree turn onto Elm Street. And it appeared that at first he wasn't targeting the car to go down Elm Street, but rather that he was targeting the service road in front of the Texas School Book Depository. And then he began to struggle as he realized that that wasn't where he was supposed to go, and he maneuvered to try and get the limousine back toward the center lane of Elm Street. And you can see that in this film. I mean, the entire turn is included in the film, whereas in the Stan Zapruder film, even though Zapruder said once he started filming, he didn't stop until the limo had gone by, the Stan Zapruder film does not show the turn on to Elm Street. So the Greer maneuvers the heavy limousine in onto Elm Street, trying as he was progressing down the street to get it to the center lane. And just about the time that he got to the point where the gunshots occurred, there was a lot of activity on the right-hand side on the curb. The first thing he noticed was the guy that we call the Umbrella Man was furiously pumping the umbrella up and down. He wasn't just holding an open umbrella as we've been fed by a number of other researchers. He was pumping the umbrella up and down. There was a lot of movement. The next thing was there was an individual that for many years we called the accomplice. And in later years, we called him the Cuban because he's a dark-complected man. He was wearing a cap, and in at least one still photograph, we can see that in his jacket, he had a radio device. I believe, although I know a couple of researchers don't agree, but I believe that that gentleman was Felipe Vidal Santiago. And he was furiously trying to get the attention of Greer. In fact, as the limo approached, that guy was in the street. He was standing in Elm Street. And there are a few still photographs where you can see that, in fact, he had stepped off the curb. And he was waving his arms. He finally signaled the driver with a closed fist, and this was clearly visible on this other film. And I'm told, I was in the Air Force, not the infantry, but I've been told that the closed fist signal is the infantryman's signal to stop. And it was quite apparent that when Greer saw the guy, he did exactly that. He stopped right there. He stopped on a dime. He stopped with such suddenness that it jostled the occupants of the limo. I mean, they were all thrown forward a bit as the limo came to a complete stop. Did not just slow down, it stopped. At that moment, Greer turned around with the limo stopped, and he faced JFK. And as he did, the choreography of this is astounding. He turned around and he stared JFK in the face, and then you see JFK's head explodes from the frangible bullet. At that point, Greer turns back around and he proceeds to get out of Dealey Plaza, although I gotta say, there was no evidence in the film that he floored it. He just saw that JFK had been hit, and he started the car. I don't know the specs on that car, how fast it can accelerate, but he did not, do a rabbit start out of Dealey Plaza. And he went forward, and the lead car, quite simply, was in his way, so he swerved to the left, and he passed the lead car and proceeded to get to Stemmons Freeway to get the president to Parkland Hospital. Now, the events that I just described took place almost as if they were choreographed. And since I and a half dozen other people that I know have seen that film, Len, there's no question in our mind as to whether the limo slowed or it stopped. It stopped. I don't mean that it parked. I mean it stopped for possibly 2 to 3 seconds. But during that interval, JFK was hit by 2 headshots. One where you could noticeably see his head move forward a bit. That would have been a shot to the rear of his head. I would suspect it was probably a low-velocity shot, just based on the movement of his head. And then, of course, the gory exploding shot from the right front. And then Greer got the limo out of Dealey Plaza. So it looked all very choreographed to me. But there's no question in our minds that the limo stopped. Now, there were a couple of frames in the extant Zapruder film. I don't remember which frame it was. I'm thinking it was 308, but I could be off, where Dr. Roderick Ryan, who worked for Kodak and was a consultant in the motion picture industry. In fact, when he retired, he got a Lifetime Achievement Award at the Oscars. He looked at the neighboring frames, and he was able to determine that the frames that showed the limo being blurred somewhat, the limo was in motion, and the one where the limo was in sharp focus, it was in sharp focus because the limo was standing still. I mean, we have even more evidence than just the other film that the limo had stopped. Now, I have to say that one would conclude from what you see between the limo reacting to somebody signaling it to stop and it stopping and so forth, that there was Secret Service complicity in the assassination. Of course, we know that agents were called off the limo, and they did not take their usual steps in protecting the car. But here we have both Greer and Kellerman aware somebody was approaching the car, and at that point, I think that I would have floored it at that point, not knowing who that individual was, but instead, Greer stopped the car. And President Kennedy's head was blown off.
All right, great clip, man. You're bringing some great clips to the show tonight.
Yeah,
Don.
I was always a huge fan of Rich De La Rosa. Whenever I heard he was going to be on a show like Black Op or somebody else is going to interview him the next week, I would mark that on my calendar. Hey, Rich De La Rosa is going to be on. You better tune in.
Bigger than life.
He was a tremendous researcher, and he passed away a few years ago. So the late, great Rich De La Rosa really bringing the info. A couple of really good points that he made there. In the actual real film, in the Zapruder film, you do not see the limo turning from Houston onto Elm. But in the real film, you do. And Rich talks about that, where Greer was trying to make that 110-degree turn, and he almost missed Elm Street completely. There's a little annex that runs in front of the school book depository building. Greer almost went down that little dead end there.
Didn't he have to back up?
No, the tires of the limo actually went up on the sidewalk. Now that breaks every Secret Service protocol for protecting the president.
You had to take that out.
Yeah.
I mean, it gets worse, especially if Oswald's in the 6th floor and he's not firing by now. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, you think he would have, if there was only a lone gunman in the Texas School Book Depository building, he would have been shooting when they were on Houston, when they were coming towards him. Why would you wait till they turn the corner?
Absolutely.
But for sure, when they make that turn and their wheels are up on the sidewalk, they're almost at a dead stop. Why wouldn't you shoot then?
Even people who are not familiar with assassination make that point. Whenever I go to Dealey Plaza, I'll bend my ear a little bit. The novice recognizes that.
Yeah, and then another thing he brings up is the ever controversial umbrella man, who was pumping the umbrella furiously. It wasn't just holding the umbrella, he was pumping it up and down. He mentioned the Cuban, or the accomplice. The guy had a radio device, and Rich thinks it was Felipe Santiago. He closed his fist, and that meant stop. And then that's when he closed his fist, that's exactly when the limo came. It just stopped on a dime.
Just like when you're working on a crane crew, you just hold your hand and a fist up, and it means to stop, and they stop the limo.
And that's when the fatal headshot occurred. And because the film was altered, the infamous X in the street that Robert Groden put there, that's in the wrong place, because the film was altered. That X is actually way too far back. It's actually, in reality, it was farther down the street, and it was really close to the manhole cover. Yep, and then just to finish up with Rich there, he talked about JFK was hit in the head twice. And see, when I watched the regular altered version of the Zapruder film, it's hard. I can't really say that he was hit twice. It looks like there's just the one shot from the right front, and that's what De La Rosa confirmed that. But you also see in the real film, you see a shot coming from behind as well, which David Mantic has confirmed in the X-rays.
All right, so you can see a guy with a radio in the film somewhere, and you can sort of detect a shot briefly. Is that just remnants of the real film?
Well, yeah, they took the real footage and combined it, so they edited some stuff out, they left some stuff in. So I guess if you look quick, that's one I haven't really spent a lot of time with, but Rich studied that closely, because he got to look at the real film.
All right, we're going to go to The Men Who Killed Kennedy, and this is one that Tom Wilson and Nigel Turner is nobody's fool, as Dr. Fetzer would say, and Dr. Fetzer told me that The Men Who Killed Kennedy series continue to get better and better, especially from 6 on up. I had gone to Dealey Plaza, and Robert Groden had told me that up until number 6, they were fantastic, but after that, it was all downhill.
Tom Wilson spent 30 years with US Steel, developing his image processing techniques for revealing imperfections in product surfaces. His expert evidence in murder cases involving gunshot wounds has been accepted in federal court. In 1988, he began to apply that expertise to images from the Kennedy assassination.
I don't think anyone has ever utilized the equipment to look at the Kennedy images, because if they have, with the expertise that I know our government has had over the past many years, then I know they will come to the same absolute conclusion that I have. As I know that President Kennedy was assassinated by somebody from the front, and that there was a conspiracy. The problem has been that in my efforts to bring hard, scientific, technical information to the public has been thwarted by everywhere I have turned. I've tried the media, I've tried the government, I've tried everything I know, and no one wants to look at the evidence.
Using image processing techniques undreamt of when Zapruder filmed the assassination, Tom has uncovered dramatic information hidden within this horrific footage.
As we go further into the brain, we are able to observe all of the damage that has occurred in this rear exit wound from the very top of the skull down into where the missile exited through the head. As you can see, this is the scalp area, the damage to the skull, the area of the skull that's been blown away by the incoming frontal missile, and now we can actually go down and see the brain, and the exiting bullet has gone through the brain, and you can see the path of the bullet here. Lee Harvey Oswald did not and could not have fired the fatal shot that killed our president.
Tom Wilson's ability to extract hidden information from the assassination pictures is based on established scientific principles.
This is photonics. This is the absolute science in the measurement of light. What is in these photographs and what is measured by the computer and backed up by hard scientific mathematical data all of my findings can be reproduced.
Badgeman shooting from the grassy knoll was first revealed in Mary Moorman's picture in The Men Who Killed Kennedy in 1988. Tom's initial work confirmed his presence. This encouraged him to apply his technology to photographic records of the assassination.
The Zapruder film allowed me to be able to go in and look at the head wound initially. The autopsy photographs allowed me to verify that there were inconsistencies within, and the pristine Mary Moorman photograph allowed me to go in and actually measure the wound optically without image processing. As we go into the wound and as we expand the wound and magnify it, you can see that the pixel elements, or each one of these little dots, is represented by dark squares or light squares. Now, if there were no wound in the rear of President Kennedy's head, all of the squares would be the basic reflective value or the basic shade of gray that his normal hair coloring would be on this day. Every time, in my years of experience with this, when there is a concave or convex area that is a deformation of the overall image, there is absolutely no question that the case is, as it goes darker under this situation, that this is going from an area on the top of President Kennedy's head down into an extremely deep hole, because the entrance wound that supported this exit wound was fired from the right frontal area of President Kennedy, and it exited through the rear. Instead of trying to find shooters or gunmen in the photographs, I decided to concentrate on President Kennedy's massive rear-end head wound. And what this enabled me to do was to be able to go in, rebuild the head wound as a mold, use the data thereof, and track back from the head wound back to the source of the shooter. This is a mold that was reproduced from the data points obtained from the pristine Mary Moorman photograph. As you can see, this allowed me to be able to show the massive amount of material that was blown from the head into the air. As the bullet entered the right temporal area, it came within his head and fragmented into two directions. The right fragment is here, the left fragment is here. And this allowed me to determine, as you can see with all the flow of forces here, that all of the material was blown up, and the entrance of the fragments came from below.
Having gathered extensive mathematical data from the assassination images, Tom went to Dealey Plaza for the first time. Taking precise measurements from the site, he correlated these with his photographic findings. The results were not as he anticipated.
When I came back and took these coordinates, which were mapped out using the machinery, not manual calculations, I could never put President Kennedy at the spot where the Zapruder film said was frame 313 when Badgeman was firing, because the projectile trajectory from Badgeman wasn't where Kennedy was. And when I put President Kennedy down the road 4 feet further, when Badgeman could hit him, Mary Moorman was in the wrong location. Mr. Zapruder wasn't fit. The fence was in the wrong place. I could not make anything fit. So I had to go back to Dallas, and I had to run more tests. And what I found out was something that I had overlooked all this time in looking at the photograph. President Kennedy's wound in his right temporal area is at an angle like this. It's coming out of the ground. And I said to myself, Tom, if the bullet was coming out of the ground, how is this possible? Because I never tried to determine where the bullet came from. I only know what it did to President Kennedy's head. This totally bewildered me that I'm at the end of this mission. President Kennedy was assassinated by a man firing a missile from inside the manhole cover at the bottom of the steps in Dealey Plaza. There is absolutely no doubt in my mind that that is exactly where that headshot came from.
Brazil, a seasoned researcher of the assassination, believes that a gunman firing at Kennedy from the storm sewer is no wild theory. In 1992, he put his ideas to the test with a trained military team. They explored the subterranean world beneath Dealey Plaza.
After carefully analyzing and researching Dealey Plaza through the years, the only two spots that an assassin could actually hide and squeeze off around at the presidential limousine would be the storm sewer that I'm standing in now and the storm drain, which is located directly behind the wooden picket fence that joins the triple underpass. Well, that's the only two spots that an assassin could hide in and actually squeeze off around and fire at the presidential limousine, and then, in lieu of that, been able to escape. It took us approximately 53 to 54 minutes, our very first trip. Now that was stopping and investigating and talking on the walkie-talkies, 2 coffee breaks, and then the second time it took 42 minutes, and the third trip it took 32 minutes, and the fourth trip it took 23 minutes. So we can rest assured that it would take an assassin approximately 20 to 30 minutes to actually escape Dealey Plaza underground. This ties in to the storm sewer in the center of Main Street, and it's easily accessible for a would-be assassin, and he could very easily have shot the president and used this route for escape, which leads directly to the Trinity River.
Computer technology.
Boy, when I first saw Tom Wilson in the late 90s, I was just completely blown away. Now, Tom Wilson has passed on as well, and it would be great to interview him or somebody that could do that sort of work today. I was just floored that a guy could take the Mormon photo, scan it like that, and then build that mold to find out where the shot came from. And his imaging processing techniques prove the shot came from the right front. You know, and Tom, of course, back then really had a tough time. The internet was just barely going back then. He had a real tough time getting his info out.
Well, Nigel Turner changed that.
Yeah, he did, yeah, but you had to release a DVD or get it on a TV show. Just a single guy in the basement, which is kind of what Tom was there at the end. You're going to have a tough go of it.
Well, I believe most of us have seen all this on YouTube. I think very few people really caught the original broadcast with the soup commercials and everything else.
I did watch that stuff back in the mid to late 90s. I was working second shift then, and I would come home and they'd have the rerun on, was it the History Channel?
Mm-hmm.
I would watch it after work. Or back in the day, I had my VCR, my trusty VCR. I would tape it and watch it later.
Let's wrap it up with Tom Wilson. What do you think?
Okay, so his conclusion was that the bullet was coming up out of the ground and it hit Kennedy in the temple. So there's no doubt in Tom's mind that bullet came from the storm sewer at the base of the stairs.
Yeah, I have to totally disagree with that, though. In the same video, he has the storm drain up where the railroad track is. Now, Dr. Fesser would be vehement about that, but
I think the bullet came from the storm drain, and it came up out of the ground, basically. Because if you watch even the extant film will show you Kennedy getting lifted up and back. You know, I'm not the only guy to believe that. John Judge did, and he's got a little piece here I found that kind of confirmed what I was saying. That because Billy Hargis was riding his motorcycle to the left rear, and he got splattered with blood and brains. So what Judge's contention was that if the shot came from the grassy knoll, the bullet would have been coming down, and the blood and brains wouldn't have been probably splattered up and out.
All right, but you're familiar with the storm drain up there by the overpass?
Yeah, by the picket fence, yeah.
Right, that's where I believe it happened. We'll just have to have a little debate about it, and we'll do our best to bring as much information to this subject as we can.
Yes, yeah, and again, I think Tom makes an impeccable point that the angle of the shot is coming from down to up.
Now, we'll say this. I was in Dealey Plaza with Dr. Fesser last November, and we did talk about that. So may not have done enough research on my own about that.
Well, so I think one part of the theory, or one part of it that is shutting people down on the storm drain is where that X is, because if you stand on that X, you can't.
It's not going to work.
No, but the X is in the wrong spot, and I think that's a big reason why Grodin maintains the authenticity of the Zapruder film.
Yeah, we've got some future shows about that. All right, Don, looks like we've done another good job. So I guess we'll close it out, the new JFK show, and let's go ahead and talk about your show and what you plan to be doing.
Yeah, in fact, you're co-hosting with me on veteranstodayradio.com. Our shows are appearing on Sundays 4 to 6 Central or 5 to 7 Eastern. We're covering a lot of topics, 9/11, Zionism, just anything that's going on. We'll probably keep the JFK stuff over here since we've already got this platform, but other type of research, you'll be hearing it over at veteranstodayradio.com.
Yeah, I understand you got some PID research coming up, huh?
Yes, as they call it, I'm a pitter, as they say, and we've got a massive interview with Claire Kuhn, who's done a mountain of work on that topic.
This one hurts, Don. I'm telling you, this is a tough one, but Claire's on it. I applaud you for bringing this to the show. If anyone's wondering, it's the Paul is Dead show, which will be on probably next week or the one after that on the Don Fox Weekend Report on Veterans Today. And I'm glad to see he's got his own show now. Very deserving of that. Thanks again for being on the show, Don.
Hey, thanks for having me, Kerry.
All right, we'll do it again soon.
You bet.